Okay, so welcome to Control of the Infospace, Democratic Failures of Social Media. I will be host for Rasmus Sebastian, and I will do a very short introduction, and it's anecdotal. So, quite some time ago, I saw a Cuban intelligence service officer who was talking to others from the Cuban military. I have great sympathies for Cuba, but I was very disappointed how he was talking about internet to his comrades. And it was really just focusing on internet as propaganda, nothing else. So it was really just about like a media war we have with the world, and this world is like controlled by the America and da-da-da-da-da-da. So I was like full of critique of how internet could be something else, a challenge, organizational, not necessarily only corporate, but some others. And then my comrade from Cuba won, actually, because like very recently, I don't know if you heard of that story, it was like revealed that USAID, which is supposed to be the American humanitarian development agency, got caught that they founded a startup in Cuba called Zua Sudan, something like that. And they just like tried to hide all of the traces where it was like now obvious that they were making that startup so they can control the development of the social media in Cuba, so that at one moment, hopefully, they will be able to control what's going on there and go on with the revolution, or what used to be called Twitter revolution and things like that. And many got like angry about it. And it's just like a kind of a hot topic these days, where we could see that the humanitarian like development agency from the US government was actually using all of these like narratives where the revolutions could happen through the social media, and then controlling the social media startup on Cuba, Zuneo, starting with 2 million names from the address book. No one actually revealed where they were coming from. I would say probably Facebook. And they got to 40,000 people, and then they got caught. And even the conservatives were really like critical about it. They were not, of course, critical about going against Cuba, but they were critical about like how, if you had that idea in USAID, you should go and knock on the door of the CIA or something, and then just like come up with that idea, not trying to do that. So I wanted just to start with more like anecdotal one, and then like leave the stage for Rasmus and Sebastian. So we'll start with Sebastian. I'll tell you a little bit about Rasmus Fleischer and Sebastian Sevignani. Rasmus, a Swedish historian, writer with the background in Piratenbyrå, a collective that questioned copyright and worked closely together with the Pirate Bay from 2003 up till now. Today he is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Economic History at Stockholm University, and his most recent book, Tapirskrift, is a collection of essays of which many touches on the very recent history of the internet, while other essays takes on larger issues about the current crisis of capitalism. Sebastian Sevignani studied communication, philosophy, and theology at the University of Salzburg, Austria. His PhD thesis engaged with the discursive and economic practical commodification processes of privacy and personal data in informational capitalism and alternatives to these processes. He holds a postdoc position at the Friedrich Schiller University Institute of Sociology in Jena, Germany. Sebastian is a member of the editorial board of the journal tripleC, Communication, Capitalism, and Critique. So, Sebastian, please.
Yeah, thank you, Marcell. Thank you for the organizers that they have invited me. Yeah, I titled my talk "The Corporate Internet and the Necessity of Privacy Crisis," and to get a first impression of what I'm concerned in this talk. It is useful to note that the politically influential World Economic Forum in 2011 claimed that personal information is emerging as a new class of assets. It is, and this is now a quote, becoming a new type of raw material that is on par with capital and labor. Besides, this claim is, which is of course very questionable from a Marxist-trained perspective, the World Economic Forum proposes new perspectives on the use of personal data. For instance, while politics was formerly concerned with minimizing privacy risks to the individual, economic elites now propose that politicians should be concerned with the right balance between individual privacy protection and economic innovation and growth. If we have a look at the current formation of the internet, then it is, in my view, evident that we are confronted with a corporate internet that is mainly based on the advertising funding model. Only one out of the top 15 websites worldwide that attract together a significant share of the entire internet population is not commercial and has no advertising-based funding model. In capitalism, no a priori coordination between societal supply and demand exists. The actual buying process, thus the realization of profits, is basically uncertain from the standpoint of producing capital. The market is the social site where it is decided whether a certain production was useful or not. It is therefore understandable that the individual capital in competition with other capitals seeks to minimize this structural uncertainty through diverse marketing techniques that aim at actually realizing profits with the produced products or services. Joseph Thoreau provides a narrative of this development of what he calls the rise of surveillance-driven culture production. From the counting of banner clicks through internet service providers to identification and tracking on behalf of cookies to the evaluation of internet queries, massive means of user surveillance were implemented on the internet. And social media are at the forefront of this development. Mobile usage of them finally connects information about potential buying behavior with concrete offline contexts of supply. A Facebook employee once admitted in an interview that Facebook stores literally everything. And Facebook announced during its stock market launch that it will and has already done extended advertising also to its users' mobile phones, and in truth targeted advertising therefore ubiquitously across all different platforms. Whereas traditional forms of advertising are directed to broad groups of potential buyers, targeted advertising is tailored to precisely defined and differentiated groups, or even individual consumers. This demands more detailed, exact, and differentiated knowledge of the user's needs and buying behavior, which can be provided by online corporations and in particular by social media corporations. I understand the term. I use the term surveillance in a critical way. That is not common sense, but I think there are good reasons using surveillance critically, because I think surveillance is always based on a power inequality between watchers and users. Power inequality is connected with an unequal distribution of means of surveillance, such as technologies, or an unequal access to them. We, the users, do not own and control Facebook's gigantic server parks, nor do we control the software of the social networking software. And we do also not control the databases in which our data is processed. Surveillance-based business models entail not only the collection, storage, and processing of users' data, but also its assessment and evaluation. Ratings of media audiences and the internet users play a crucial role in this context. Through ratings, users are made quantitatively comparable in order to be tagged by a price in the process of commodification. It is the fabrication of audiences or images of audiences that needs, I think, our special critical attention. Social media are online platforms where users share and disclose what they like or are interested in. And this kind of information about their potential buyers is even more valuable for marketers and advertisers. There is really strong empirical evidence that users disclose more personal information on social media than they disclose in general. Commercial social media try to optimize this user participation and social networking building in respect with the expectation that this would contribute to their profit aims. And indeed, commercial social media consistently come into conflict with privacy and have triggered several public outcries in this regard. Examples are the complaints against the leading social networking sites, Facebook, such as the complaints by the US-based Electronic Privacy Information Center, the complaints by Austrian students addressed to the Irish Data Protection Commissioner, which is the so-called Europe versus Facebook initiative, or the, for example, the investigation by the Nordic Data Inspection Agencies. I argue that the surveillance-based online business models of social media structurally poses potential privacy threats to users. I use here the term structurally since surveillance is inherent to informational capitalism as a whole, and in particular to present online business models. I use, on the other hand, the term potential, since a privacy threat is frequently considered as a pure subjective matter and does not necessarily result from the surveillance that I have described so far. Also, one can argue that the concept of privacy is the opponent to surveillance, and the capitalist organization of the internet causes here a contradiction, which should be expressed by this, this figure here. I'm quite skeptical about the value of privacy, the value of the concept of privacy. And I will illustrate my concern on behalf of a telling sequence of Facebook terms of use. Without consent to this statement, nobody can use Facebook. And I quote now from the terms of use, and you can read it on the slide. It says, you own all of the content and information you post on Facebook, and you can control how it is shared through your privacy settings. In addition, you grant us a non-exclusive, transferable, sub-licensable, royalty-free, worldwide license to use any IP, intellectual property, content that you post or in connection on or in connection with Facebook. In my view, the contract says two main things. First, you are addressed as a person. You are addressed here as a person who has a right of privacy by nature. You, so to say, own your privacy, and you owe nothing, you owe society nothing for this possession. And the second thing, what in my view the statement says, is that since you are addressed as an owner, it is consequent that you are also able to alienate, to exchange your privacy, which is the very condition to use social media in the corporate internet. Contracts in general always include, on the one hand, an aspect of inalienability, which is here expressed in the first part of the quote, namely the universal right to be an owner. Without this state-guaranteed right, capitalism as we know it could not work. And on the other hand, they include an aspect of alienability, which is here expressed in the second part of the quote that deals with the licensing. And I see here an analogy between that what Marx calls the double freedom of the laborer. He's free from the means of production, and we can transfer today to say we are free of the means of social cooperation or communication. This is the one freedom. On the other hand, he is free to exchange in contracts, in work contracts, to receive wages. And here we can transfer it, and we are free to exchange our personal data and our privacy. The dominant concept of privacy, which I would call a possessive individualistic one, connects exactly to these two aspects. Commonly, privacy is defined as the individual control about personal information. The individual being in control is universally guaranteed, for instance, by law. And because this is so, the individual is able to alienate privacy or exchange it for the service commercial social media provide. My point is here that the dominant concept of privacy is quite compatible to commercial social media's business model. This should be expressed by the now completed figure on the slide. Both privacy and surveillance have a common ground in capitalism, which is private property. And if this observation is right, then I think struggles for privacy might not be really sustainable to oppose to surveillance. We have to look for alternatives. And I alternatively suggest to frame privacy struggles through the lens of two core categories of critical theory tradition, namely exploitation and alienation. The capitalist internet distinguishes itself through the social institution of private property in the means of online communication, cooperation, and surveillance. Users and employees produce social media but do not own and control them. This enables owners of the internet services to link two modes of production together, namely social cooperation or the production of commons on social media on the one hand, and commodity production for the advertising industry on the other hand. Without the user activity on the platform, Marcell already said this, Facebook could not sell the audience or privacy commodity to the advertising industry. It could not be profitable without the activity of users. I would argue that Facebook exploits its users, and this exploitation sets the stage for Facebook's power to set the terms of using social networks. And this power has its base foremost in monetary or economic power. For instance, Facebook can and does buy competitors like recently Telegram, the messenger service, but economic power can also be transformed in is also be transformed in other forms of power, such as political power. Internet corporations can and do, for instance, influence privacy legislation. Based on economic power, Facebook and others are also able to accumulate what Manuel Castells calls network making power, which is the power, now I quote him, to program specific networks according to the interests and values of the programmers, and the power to switch different networks following the strategic alliances between the dominant actors of various networks. For the sake of pointed emphasis, I like you to consider the following example. According to the last year's Forbes, the world's billionaires list, there are 7 billionaires among the 75 richest individuals in the world that can directly be associated with the top 15 websites. Mark Zuckerberg, the founder, CEO, and main stockholder of Facebook, is one of them. And due to power asymmetries, which I tried to describe briefly now, owners of internet services are able to set the terms to which users can only benefit from the service in concert with their profit goals. For instance, Mark Zuckerberg once powerfully announced in an interview that the age of privacy would be over, and he said, we decided that these would be the social norm now, and we just went for it. Exploitation and power asymmetries in society are connected to the second problem which I see in the corporate internet. Commercial social media are alienated spaces in my view. Alienation means most generally that man-made things exercise power over man, and that therefore we do things voluntarily that actually contradict our will. On the individual level, I think experiences of privacy trade-offs, which we probably all do in a certain way, can be seen as phenomena of alienation. Users' privacy trade-offs are not really self-determined. Rather, they face constrained decisional freedoms in terms of consciousness of the rules of the corporate social media, a limited range of decision and a limited range of decision opportunities. For instance, there is no opt-out to advertising possible for the user, and there are no equally attractive alternatives available at the moment. It is the feeling, we can of course discuss about this, it is the feeling of suspending privacy concerns for the sake of communication and social cooperation that I would interpret as a feeling of alienation. Users do use social media voluntarily, but this usage actually contradicts their will. On the social level, an expression of alienation, in my view, is that the profit principle forces internet service providers to disrespect privacy. Also, privacy is commonly declared as an important value in liberal societies. Here we face the kind of a kind of contradiction between capitalist societies' commitment to markets and their commitment to individual rights. I already argued that users produce social media, but their activity is turned against them if social media conflict with privacy needs. Users are not in control of the production process of social media. They are not in control of the conditions within which their communication and cooperation takes place online. Although they remain with a formal ownership of the produced data. Owners of social media set the terms of how we socialize online. They develop complex and often confusing terms of use and privacy policies that legally allow surveillance and to which users can hardly give an informed consent. In both cases, one could argue that society has itself established rules that come into contradictions with things that are considered widely as valuable in our society. Yeah, within this short talk, I tried to show that the serious problems of exploitation, alienation, show up when privacy is commodified, when personal information becomes a commodity in the corporate internet. And I suggest to widen existing privacy struggles, and open them up for these problems, namely alienation, exploitation processes on the internet. Yeah. Thank you for your attention.
I'll try to use a digital whiteboard. Yes, prepare this. How do you get full screen? No, that's not. No, no. Oh, yeah. No. Or anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah. All right. Yes, I am using the concept of counter-revolution because that's the direction where I think the current development of the internet is pointing. Such a statement implies that the internet is, of course, not a neutral technology, and that it also does not have one given logic valid for all time. Instead, I think it's important to point out that the internet has a history which is ongoing, and that internet in its history already has passed several turning points, passed through several phases of development. And as I think about this, the last one of these turning points was when the counter-revolution took over. And I'm thinking that happened from 2007 onwards, in a striking parallel with the unfolding of the global financial crisis. At least in the beginning, this was a counter-revolution with a very friendly face. The counter-revolutionary vanguards carried flags with words like social, mobile, open, sharing, streaming, joining, inviting. It was and it is a counter-revolution of the digital smorgasbord. So, I'm not the first one here to question the use of the term social, but of course, social media, what's called social media, are central to this counter-revolution. And it's very clear how the adjective social takes on a very specific meaning. There are, of course, many possible ways to socialize. There are many ways to mediate sociality, but in this period, in this time, the concept of social media is used in a much, much more narrow way. What we call social today is practically defined by a few leading monopolists, while every new startup firm that wants to attract investors, they are basically implementing the same basic model of sociality and the same kind of interface. And I will get back to the homogenization of the interface in today's social media. Now, let me try to summarize how I think, what I think are the characteristics of this counter-revolutionary time where we live today on the internet. I'll just write down a few phrases. The first one is very obvious. We have a monopolization. Meaning that everyday interactions between people are increasingly dependent on a few monopolist service providers. And the same goes for cultural distribution, the same goes for political activism even. However, I think it would be wrong to identify the counter-revolutionary development with only a few evil corporations. The monopolization, even though there are certain monopolists who are definitely leading, the tendency to monopolization also affects anyone. I mean, anyone who wants to have a part of this social media landscape must, in a sense, submit to this principle and attempt to become a monopolist herself. So I think the monopolizing tendency has also been a large part of it has taken part in ruining the potential that was in projects like the Pirate Bay or WikiLeaks. As I understand it, these projects initially had the ambition to set examples and to inspire, to be copied, and to multiply. But they were somehow caught in a dynamic where they monopolized themselves and made themselves big. It almost became like an end in itself. They were caught in a dynamic where they had like no alternative but to stage a new riot every week or to fade away. And something similar could be said to the phenomenon of the Northern European phenomenon of the pirate parties, which, at least in Sweden, have tended to monopolize internet-related politics and re-encode these issues in the language of rights, endlessly reenacting the immanent contradictions of liberal ideology. So we have like the copyright versus privacy, we have privacy versus transparency, and et cetera, et cetera. And I fully agree with Sebastian's points about the limits of the concepts of privacy. So parts of this monopolization is, it could also be called platformization. I would say we have a new regime of innovation in digital media where all efforts go towards building platforms which are owned by a company. And this stands in contrast to the preceding era, the preceding regime of innovation, if you want to, which was a time, I'm talking about like the time between, let's say, 2001, 2007, which was a time with very much development of new protocols, not only new platforms. That kind of innovation, the innovation of new protocols, now seems to have halted, with maybe just one exception, which is protocols for cryptocurrencies, like bitcoins. Yet another part of this is that the development of free software is stifled to a large degree. As Marcell pointed out, free software is far from being abandoned on the server side. It is used more and more, but the promise of free software as a part of everyday life for people is far away today. You don't hear much of those visions that you could hear in the middle of the preceding decade. So, and of course this is because software is now more and more run at a server instead of distributed to computers. And I think it's interesting to see if we compare like the earlier proponents for free software, that the people tended to think that the main enemy was Microsoft, the attempt to sell software per unit, but that turned out to be not the case. Rather it was the migration of software to the cloud that stifled free software. All right. Next tendency, I don't know if it's the right word, but let's say mobilization. And with that, I just mean mobile phones. As the smartphones and tablets as the new central hardware based on touch screens. And tendentially, this means an abandonment of the personal computer as well as specialized mobile devices of different kinds. I mean, last decade we had a growing mass market for specialized devices like the digital compact camera, the digital music players like the iPod, and the e-reader like the Kindle. These devices are now more and more abolished from the mass market, and their functions are instead incorporated, although sometimes in a suboptimal way, in smartphones and tablets. So these gadgets are instead designed for the consumption of multimedia, and the result of this is, of course, that photography, music listening, and book reading is subject to a new level of distraction. So all visions for growing mass market for e-books should also be forgotten now, I think. They will not stand to the level of distraction in today's multimedia devices. But the turn to smartphones and tablets is tendentially meaning that the time of personal computers is approaching its end. And I think it's very significant if we now stick to my hypothesis that this counter-revolution starts in 2007. I think it's significant that that was in January 2007 was the time when Apple Computer Incorporated changed its official name to just Apple. It was not Apple Computer anymore. They began to distance themselves from the very concept of computers. So in the summer the same year, Apple released its first iPhone, which is of course a pocket computer, but in the disguise of a mobile phone. And it was a formidable success, followed by other companies. The abolishment of buttons in favor of a touch screen was a strong signal that the smartphone was an entirely new category of products beyond the existing categories of computers and phones. If that product would have been recognized as a miniature computer or with some phone features built in, it would have been much harder for Apple to make consumers accept that the operating system is built on actual censorship of software. And so you have a fully new degree of lock-in and control in these operating systems, which would not be accepted. I mean, doesn't really go together with the established norms of the personal computer. So, as you know, each and every application must be accepted by Apple, and even after it has been installed, it can be deleted on order by Apple. So this is the new standard, which also allows, of course, Apple to extract an extra rent by a percentage on sales and so on. And also, in theory, to ban software or cultural expressions on grounds that may be commercial or moral or political. This is, I mean, Apple is, of course, only the company in the front line here. They are, since 2007, pointing the way for a consumer market for computers beyond the traditional concept of the personal computer. Just as Apple once, many years ago, as Marcell explained, was the company who pointed the way towards the mass market for personal computing. So that's just a company that plays a main role in marketing and designing gadgets and defining their use. So the new hardware that's central to this climate is hardware optimized for the consumption of multimedia feeds, and designed to be always online, so that they can be surveilled and monitored in detail. We also see that if we look at the mass market for consumer electronic, there is the previous trend towards ever more storage has been broken. There was, for some years ago, lots of talk about not only Moore's law, about processors, microprocessor capacity, but also another supposed law called Kreider's law, that there was about data storage. And it was for a long time the case that consumer products had more and more megabytes, gigabytes, terabytes of storage, doubling every 2 years or so. That's no longer the case. Now they are on a steady level or even declining. I would say it's of course difficult to have to measure that, but yeah. Also here, Apple is the most obvious example, because Apple in the previous decade, Apple marketed the iPod, which was tended to come with more and more gigabytes of data, and which as a kind of an open invitation to illegal file sharing. But now they are marketing products with less and less storage, because these products are made for consuming data which is stored elsewhere. So centralization, maybe, is an appropriate term for this migration of the archive to the cloud. And goes together with the marketing of hardware with high bandwidth but low storage capacity, relatively. And the new consumer habit that's associated with these products does no longer include the habitual structuring of personal archives, but instead people are invited to rely on cloud-based services to provide them with whatever they need. This centralization can also be connected to a more broader trend, which is part of this, which we could actually call financialization. And with that, I only mean the general turn towards subscription-based models, and away from the sale of hardware or software as units, so instead more and more kinds of leasing. While the personal computer is still, I think, largely a material product which is sold for a one-time cash payment, smartphones are almost always sold on credit. You sign a contract with the cost divided over 1 to 3 years, and the credit arrangement takes the shape of a subscription at a telecom company, and it can very well be packaged together with some subscription for entertainment at Spotify or Netflix. So the more common it becomes to buy hardware on credit, the closer consumers are also tied to certain monopolists, and the closer the monopolists are tied together with each other. So I think it's clear interrelation between financialization, monopolization, and the infrastructural centralization. And of course, the personalization. As the user of social media is usually expected to be logged in all the time, anonymity is not really accepted. And since around 2007, Google has transformed its search engine a lot, from being a kind of a pseudo-objective search engine based on the universal PageRank algorithm towards a search engine which gives personalized results. Even if you are not logged in, it tries to personalize you, and it's kind of successful in that. And of course, the establishment of Gmail plays a huge part in keeping Google users logged in all the time. So providing a free email service was an important step for Google there. So having users logged in makes it possible to map their behaviors much more closely and to deliver so-called personalized advertisements, but also other kinds of information personalized, such as news. And there has been, of course, a lot of talk about the so-called filter bubble, and whatever the details about that, I think it's clear that this is the general direction which also traditional media is now drawn towards. So my guess is that in a couple of years, you cannot go to like the front page of New York Times and expect to see what others are seeing, because you will get like a personalized selection of news depending on who you are. Maybe even the contents of the articles will change depending on who you are. Like if you like reading longer texts, you will get longer articles. If you're not, then you will get the short version, the light version. And as a bonus, personalization, of course, creates far better conditions for state surveillance. Now, finally, the feature I was mentioning before, the homogenization of the interfaces. I mean, what we call social media is really a monoculture centered on two basic functions: the home feed and the search box. This duality of functions is tendentially replacing the older duality of hypertext and hierarchy. If we go back to the internet of the 90s, we had hypertext represented by the HTTP protocol, and the hierarchy was in the file system and the file transfer protocol. That kind of folder hierarchies was also a big main part of many of the earlier file sharing programs. That during the last decade, that kind of functions, there was a much bigger plurality of functions. We got the wiki formats that we had tag clouds, virtual reality, blogs, RSS feeds, like a plurality of feeds on different speeds, while in these counter-revolutionary times, we have a tendency that every single feed is merged into one singular personalized feed. If you go to Facebook, for example, or Twitter, you have the continuous feed where you can always turn if you don't know how to get distracted. We take like the search box. The main quality of the search box is its emptiness. It presupposes that the individual user does already know what she wants to have, and that she can express that in text. On the other hand, the home feed's main quality is speed. Every data flow is merged into one singular feed, and with this comes a synchronization of time. And the tendency, of course, is that the slow speeds are droning, and the fast speeds are what gets through. At the same time, this combination of interfaces, the home feed and the search box, tends to mean that the horizon of memory is shrinking. Archives over older information becomes harder to find than before. If you go back to the more classical blog format, it was very easy to go back in the archives. Always, it was always a link to the archives, very easily to find, which is with microblogs like Twitter, the complete opposite. It's usually very, very hard to go back and follow some conversation which happened on Twitter just one day ago. It's not that things are not archived. It's still there, and it's usually searchable but the search results are deprived of context. And actually what we call search results is generally also a kind of personalized feed. When we get search results on today's internet, it's usually sorted by something called relevance. And no one and you can never know, I mean, what relevance really means, to whom it's supposed to be relevant. But that kinds of algorithms are very central part of this development. All right, how much time do I left?
7 minutes.
Great, great. So, when I say that this is counter-revolutionary, it does not mean that the opposite feature would in every case be revolutionary or emancipatory or progressive. I mean, of course, a movement away from monopolization would generally be a good thing, but it's not like that we should abolish mobile devices and go back to desktops, or that not even that decentralization of infrastructure is always better than centralization. It's much more complex than that. And yeah, I mean, so this is just aspects of a general development which I choose to call counter-revolutionary. And of course, the problem with such a term is that it seems to imply a digital revolution that happened in the past, which I don't really think happened. There was never any fulfilled digital revolution, and there will never be. If we could ever talk about the digital revolution, it would it could only mean the third industrial revolution, beginning in the 70s, 80s. So that's a development which has been going on for decades, and it's going on. And I mean, that's an industrial revolution. That's a simple acceleration in the continuous process of capitalism, of minimizing the need for human labor in the production of commodities. That's a process driven by the competition of profits on the market, and the current crisis is only intensifying that competition. So all kinds of corporations are now pushed towards big data, and they are threatened to be eliminated if they fail to live up to the standards of data mining. And that goes for not only like internet companies, but food stores or whatever. Everybody needs to get into big data if they are to survive in this stage of capitalism. However, during this long process, the process of the third industrial revolution, there has been a few openings, I think. I mean, and I think about like times when the uses of digital technologies has tended to a larger degree to break away from this industrial logic. There might have been a few interesting years in the 1990s before the dot-com bubble. I will leave the question to the people at NetTime mailing list if that's the case or not. But I'm quite sure, or like my own experience is that there were actually a few interesting years after the dot-com crash. And yeah, I'm thinking about like the period roughly between 2001 and 2007 as a kind of opening in the history of the internet. Not a revolution, but a time with a higher degree of autonomy in the innovation, and new forms of collective practice which were not easily integrated in economy, and not very suited for data mining. So if the current counter-revolution did indeed react against something, it was against the subversive or revolutionary potential which were building up in the years following the dot-com crash, in the afterglow of the dot-com bubble, if you want. So this also must, of course, be related to the financial dynamics of global capitalism. In the beginning of this century, capital fled from the dot-com sector, and for capitalism as a system, the dot-com crash was, I mean, really threatening. It revealed a serious threat of deflation, but central banks injected already at that time enormous amounts of stimulation, liquidity. So these credits rushed towards other sectors, away from the dot-com sector, and most notably towards housing. So then we got the housing bubble. I mean, and in the shadows of that, we had some years with a relative surplus of bandwidth, surplus of hardware, and a surplus of highly skilled hackers, people who had maybe been working in the dot-com sector during the bubble and were no longer employed or were just working part-time as consultants or so. So that meant there were more people who had free time to experiment with available resources. So my interpretation is that it was out of the early, out of this recession of the early century, grew a boom for free software, a boom for file sharing, and a wave of innovation which tended to be not about just building platforms, but about developing new protocols. Of course, the file sharing protocols like BitTorrent was one part of it. The RSS protocol, which created the whole blog explosion, was another one. And it's also significant how Google today is really trying to eliminate RSS from the internet. This was the time when we got new standards for sociality on the web, the blog, the wiki, lots of threaded forums at the same time, things that could be run on simple service with open source software. It did not need you to go to Amazon. You could run it in your own home if you wanted to. And this was a time when we saw more of plurality of interfaces. I mean, we had still the older twins of horizontal hypertext and hierarchical folder systems, but then we had also other kinds of feeds and flows and tag clouds and search engines. So this amounted to a plurality of speeds. Many degrees of fast and slow communication could coexist in the everyday uses of the internet. And we don't have that plurality anymore. Since about 2007, time on the internet is being more homogenized again. As I've mentioned, the counter-revolution is also abolishing hypertext more and more, as well as abolishing folder hierarchies as a way of navigating. The new monoculture is built on the home feed and the search box. It's obviously we cannot. It's not enough to question centralization or question corporate power and attempts to create alternatives to Facebook are I think they are doomed to fail, because you have to take on this whole development. What we need is not like a non-commercial or decentralized version of the same monoculture, but we need experimentation. We need much more development, not only of new platforms, but of new practices, new ways of interacting, new protocols again. And who should do all this experimentation? That's a tricky issue, because the hacker surplus isn't there anymore. Although we are in a global financial crisis, the dot-com sector is again in a kind of boom, or maybe even bubble. And at least if now I'm mostly talking from a Swedish perspective, but in Stockholm right now, it really feels like we're getting into a similar situation like in the last dot-com bubble. Every people who can write some lines of code are being like employed. People do not have time to sit home and experiment. So all of those young programmers who were some years ago swarming to promote peer-to-peer file sharing in solidarity with Pirate Bay, those hackers are now all employed by Spotify. So I don't know if this is a second bubble, which is to be followed by a second .com crash. Maybe that's our only hope. But I think it's clear that the counter-revolution I'm talking about began when venture capital once again began to rush towards the internet. And this was, in some way or another, closely connected to the onset of the global financial crisis. Yeah, I'll end there. Thank you.
Should I use this mic or no? Okay. Maybe we can start with I have some questions here, but maybe we can start with the questions from the okay. So I'll go back to I think that we have like a few kind of clusters. One is mostly about like privacy and kind of inappropriate concept where we ended up, so that it doesn't really address the problems, which are the real problems of what we have now. And another one is what Rasmus was bringing, mostly about what happens when that concentration of power, control, and capital happens, and how it happens. So I would like to go like back to the exploitation. So I heard that many times, and I like to start this conversation just checking like the kind of like how much that exploitation, for example, of Facebook users can resonate. So what's the potential like of mobilization of people while doing that? So I usually start that with saying that just putting it into perspective. So people would say that many companies exploit their workers, so they do something for their work, and then they just make a huge extra profits out of it. So if we make the Facebook users into workers, then we also need to know like what are these like what are the scales of that. So Facebook got like around 1 billion users some time ago. So that's good because it makes the elementary mathematics here easy. And then they got like very recently into $6 billion of revenue per year. It used to be like a 4.5, and now getting to the $6 billion per year. That means that they make $6 per year per user, which means that they make $0.50 per month per user. So yeah, my question is like how do you like what's the then like usefulness of that topic when you put it onto that kind of a map of the of how much they earn at least, because that's a quite good evaluation of the one of the evaluations of these companies and what's their kind of what's their power.
If you break it down to the individual user, then of course it becomes a sort of side effect and not very suitable for mobilization. But if you keep it on the more social level, then there are users, the users as a community who communicate on Facebook, for example, and there are very few capitalists, then I think this, so like we are the 99%, this yeah, this slogan or this understanding might be suitable for mobilizing. So it is not, maybe it's not, we need a redefinition of exploitation in this way, and we cannot say you are exploited and you feel it, and therefore you have to go on the street. So it's more difficult, and I would stick with the concept of exploitation. I would not apply it to the single individual Facebook user.
That's also a question for you, Rasmus.
Yeah, I'm kind of skeptical to the mobilizing potential in talking about exploitation, and I also think there are some theoretical problems with it. I know that, I mean, it's obviously one way is to boil this down into different readings of Marx's critique of political economy, where, as I understand it, many of the attempts to discuss exploitation in social media relies on the interpretation of Italian post-operaist thinkers like Antonio Negri and so on. And I do not really subscribe to their theory of immaterial labor, but that's maybe another issue. I think that exploitation in this Marxian sense is something that's happening with waged labor, with the use of labor power in commodity production. So maybe I'm a bit traditional there even, but I think the important thing is that I don't think that the problem is that these companies are doing money. I mean, of course, distribution of resources should be thematized, and we should definitely talk about exploitation when we, as before. I mean, when we talk about laborers in the hardware industry, for example. But I think that we need a critique of social media independently of, and a critique of big data independently of the profits they make or not, or with the profits which they are not making. Because if we look at a company like Spotify, a Swedish company, they are not even doing a profit. They are doing huge losses, but they are still completely redefining the ways people in Sweden are relating to music, and have completely monopolized music in Sweden, I could say. So I think it's a tricky concept to use in many cases.
Okay, I'll go up with the other cluster then. Please, raise your hand if you. Okay, maybe we can go then.
Well, very quickly, just one question to each of you. Sebastian, you said you were uncomfortable with the concept of privacy, by which I understood you to mean you're uncomfortable with the bourgeois conception of privacy in relation to private property, but you didn't say anything about alternative notions of privacy. I mean, should we be making that whole notion redundant? Is there nothing that can be salvaged, even from a classical 19th century political economy idea of owning something about yourself? So is there anything more you could say about privacy itself, which is independent just of a completely privatized notion? And also, Rasmus, it's very interesting what you're saying, but about the counter-revolution. You did preempt my answer by saying, well, obviously that means there must have been a revolution. I don't think there has been. But I don't know, did anyone else not think that's not entirely convincing? Because you can't just say that. I mean, that's just a rhetorical device. If there has been a counter-revolution that implies that those spaces and those moments between 2001 and 2007 constituted something qualitatively different. It constituted not just opportunities for for particular forms of collaboration and innovation, independent of, state control or just profit. And I don't know where that leaves us with in terms of, you just sound nostalgic. I mean, I was really convinced by the the detailed points you're making about what was possible then. But actually, for most people, surely that will just sound nostalgic. Actually, all technologies, in a way, go through these kinds of cycles where you see moments of uncertainty while the most powerful groups figure out what to do with these things. And then they figure out, they need private property relations, and they sort themselves out. But it doesn't mean that anything is resolved. I mean, Google's, and the amount of money, just what you were saying, the amount of money per user that Google and Facebook make is of tremendous concern to them, because they're constantly under pressure in order to increase it. And actually, particularly with Google, as far as I can understand, they're quite concerned about their ability to increase. They see it actually going in a different direction, which means there's pressure on them to look at other ways of maximizing their revenue. They're actually not cocky about this. They're deeply traumatized about how to keep up their profitability. So have I misread you? Are you much more than just nostalgic in relation to all this?
Yes, I am much more than just nostalgic, but I'm toying with the concept of nostalgia. This is not an academic paper. This is like an intervention which comes out from partly a specifically Swedish context, where we, our group was working closely with the Pirate Bay, and I mean, we were always being labeled as like the future-directed people, and we were not comfortable with that. So playing with nostalgia is one way to get out of that. But what I want to get away from is the linearity of this whole narrative, that we should never look back. I think we should also look back to the plurality of interfaces that has existed before. And I think that even things like navigating in hierarchical folder structures could have a productive place in future modes of cooperation, future ways of mediating social practice. So, but yes, of course, it's toying with nostalgia in a sense.
First of all, to be clear, I don't believe for abolishing the concept of privacy nor the concept of property completely. But the thing, what I try to show is that the value of privacy, or the value which we attribute to privacy, is contradictory, or comes into to grant privacy to people guides to the structural undermination of privacy of the same people. So there's a contradiction, and that is not to say that the values behind privacy are wrong and we should them replace. It is to say that we should change the circumstances in which some people can exploit privacy and do it, and this has to do that there is a difference between private property in my own personal data and private property in means of surveillance or means of communication. And what I try to do is to say that if we want privacy sustainably, then we must change the circumstances, social circumstances. And this might then also mean for the concept of privacy, it might be also a bit affected from this, that we cannot say that we possess privacy as by nature, but that we must go into democratic negotiations. Thank you. About what we really want. Yeah, and now it is said that we possess it, and it's up to the individual, the atomized individual, and this yeah, this contributes to its exchange, and it contributes to power inequalities, which then contribute to a threat of privacy. And I think, I think if we want privacy, then we have to change the concrete social historical conditions in which we live. And I think we all need a certain kind of privacy. It's not like I imagine a society where no privacy exists.
Okay, I can go with another one. I mean, I would like to discuss more about the privacy, but I would also like to go back to another one, which I think that it's. I brought here just. I think that this was the peak of that kind of fantasy and peak of that great internet. That was when Time just said that you are the man of the year, and then you will change the future and whatever. Just small reference. But another one is coming from that kind of dynamics of the standardization and centralization. So standardization is a process which was like one of the essential processes for industrialization. So at the beginning, for example, just one example, at the beginning of 19th century, you just got screws standardized. And that was already on its own a huge revolution, so that you can just rely that there is a screw of the same size, like with the whatever. So just one kind of example. And then these centralization quite happen around standardization. There is a standardization around like a file format. There is a standardization around like a protocol. There is a standardization about the user interface, or what you call the homogenization. And whenever we get into any kind of economy of scale, of anything which relates to network effect, standardization is an essential part of that. And talking about the plurality, it's almost like it's in direct contradiction. You can't get it without like some kind of a standard. So it should be like a proxy. You should mediate that. And just one example here, what happens especially in capitalism all the time. So there is a concentration of power, and even for capitalism, sometimes it's too much. So that's why they invented the instrument which is called antitrust. And this is what happened with AT&T when they split the AT&T because America just decided that they cannot come. And then you can see in just less than 20 years, it got completely together. So, so there is another example. This is one just from the capitalism. But then we also had some experiments, for example, in blogs, where we cannot really say, especially in the early days of blogs, that was regulated. That was only driven by profit or anything like that. It was obviously economy of attention without that much profit there. And then it just the same kind of thing happened. Very few blogs got super popular, and most of the blogs are never read at all. So that's my question. So how do you see that kind of dynamic? How do you see that tension? How do you see that plurality? I hate that word. And then the dynamics of the standardization, which leads to the centralization, and how do you see that tension? How do you see what are the alternatives here? Because for me, it seems that that in the highly regulated world, it goes there. In less regulated or only regulated to market logic, it again ends there. And then when you have even just a free flow information, then again it ends there. So what are the alternatives? Or is there any alternative?
I guess that's where the need for experimentation comes in. And I really agree with the need to underline that plurality rests on standards, and the same thing, of course, with centralization and decentralization. It's much too easy to just point to decentralization as the solution to everything. Even decentralized file sharing networks have been are always relying on centralized or semi-centralized indexes, so one way or another, and that has been like also the points of weakness in the history of file sharing networks. Of course, the economies of attention has to do with it. This, like what kinds of relation between the central and the decentralized that are established, but most of all, I think it has to do with like all the interfaces between the digital and the reality, the rest of the reality. I think like as soon as a digital service becomes a semi-closed system where we are just confronted with an abundance of information, and then you have to rely on maybe a search engine, then you have to know what to write in the search box, and then you write something that you already know about, and then the economy of attention is strengthened. So it's definitely the case with search engines that they are, if we take like in music services or whatever, as soon as you have to search for something before you can listen to it, it will be a vehicle for strengthened attention economy. Of course, with optimized recommendation systems, it's different. They can be programmed in different ways. And in that case, it's of course depends on who are controlling these recommendation systems. If we take like a music service like Spotify, it's very clear that their recommendation systems are designed to promote the already very popular artists or the upcoming artists that are planned to become popular, because Spotify is owned by the 4 big record labels. Other kinds of recommendation systems are not as obviously involved in actively promoting the economies of attention. But I think, if we want to promote some kind of plurality, we have to, of course, think about what kind of plurality is it that we want to. What I'm out for is not like a complete fragmentation of what points of reference we have, but rather when we think about like the culture of discussing politics or sharing cultural phenomena, I think this point with the coexistence of slower and faster speeds is a very important one today, when we have a very, very homogenic time on the internet.
Sebastian, for you, does that like
I took your question not
okay. Is there any questions from the audience?
I was interested in this change of paradigms that we witness with interface as a kind of the most obvious and most evident kind of manifestation of what is the dynamics within industry. And I'm curious about how does your research include fringe technologies or kind of non-normative or outsiders work in this field, because I think reducing examples of what is now social software or how is it used to just Facebook or Twitter or something like this is really oversimplification. And when you think of social software in broader terms, that you think maybe of like dating websites or trading websites or websites of special communities like, I don't know, couch surfers or something like this, like all of these ideas of metaphors through interface significantly change and significantly diversify and kind of show in different directions. So I think this can be kind of overly critical and kind of discouraging discussion if we just look at these examples.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And I hope to think more about that. And I can also mention that my research does not at all concern interfaces. This is not my area of academic expertise. And yes, I am oversimplifying here. And of course, this is like my method in this context is oversimplification in a sense. I want to find what general trends there are in everyday use of digital media and see where that points. But you are absolutely right that certain more specialized social media, if you want to call them that, are important to take into